This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 842 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. Before getting into the trends this week, I wanted to send a reminder about the Late Round Fantasy Football Patreon. I know the season's getting closer to finishing up, but the Patreon includes things like weekly rankings and tiers, monthly dynasty rankings and tiers, which includes single quarterback and superflex leagues, live stream Q&As, data dumps, and more. You can learn more about it over on lateround.com. Now let's get to these 10 trends. Luke Musgrave is on IR, so the Packers are on to their other rookie tight end in Tucker Kraft. In Week 12, Kraft ran a route on 81% of Green Bay's dropbacks. That was the third highest route participation by a Packers tight end this season. Now, it only resulted in a 6.7% target share, but it does look like Tucker Kraft is going to be used just like Luke Musgrave was, which means he'll probably be referenced on the Sleeper Show each week just to get you 5.5 PPR points. One very obvious trend to talk about this week is with the Ravens' backfield. Keaton Mitchell ended up leading that backfield with a 46% snap share in Week 12. He played 32 offensive snaps, Justice Hill was at 20, Gus Edwards 18. That resulted in Mitchell having a 41% running back rush share, which was his highest of the season. And he also ran a route on 38% of Baltimore's dropbacks, also a season high. Things are for sure trending up for Keaton Mitchell. I'm still very bullish on Josh Downs. He only scored 9.3 PPR points this past week, and you might look at his last 3 games and not be very motivated to trade for him or start him in your fantasy lineup. But he didn't play his normal snap rate in 2 of those contests, and this past week, he had a 32.5% target share. I think Downs is still hugely underrated in redraft, probably in Dynasty too. The Colts' rest of season schedule is pretty average at this point for wide receivers, but he should be able to produce. Now, speaking of the Colts, you guys know that I like talking about how teams score their touchdowns, because how teams score touchdowns generally regresses. I've talked about this with Denver and Baltimore this season. Those are 2 teams who have been scoring touchdowns a little bit differently than they should. Denver has too many passing touchdowns, Baltimore has too many rushing touchdowns, and those numbers have started to regress over the last handful of weeks. One team that I haven't talked about, though, is Indianapolis. They currently have scored 41% of their touchdowns through the air. Based on their pass rate, we'd expect that number to be closer to 63%. Now, obviously, personnel plays a role here, but I would still expect at least a little bit more from that passing attack in fantasy football moving forward. Terry McLaurin's not having that great of a season. He's averaging 12.3 PPR points per game. He's a low-end wide receiver 3. Considering where a lot of people drafted him, he's not totally living up to expectation. But get this, in McLaurin's 2 games against Philadelphia this year, he's averaged 20 PPR points per game. In games not against the Eagles, that falls to 10.8. He hasn't ranked higher than wide receiver 20 in weekly scoring against a non-Eagles team this season. Washington wideouts have a bottom 10 playoff schedule by adjusted fantasy points allowed. It's really tough to buy into Terry McLaurin right now. Here's another wide receiver split for you. Justin Fields missed 4 games this year. He's played 8. In those 4 games missed, DJ Moore averaged 9.8 PPR points per game. His target share per game, 23.9%. With Justin Fields, things have been completely different. His target share per game is 30.4%. His PPR points per game output, it goes from 9.8 without Fields to 20.7 with him. To give you some context, 20.7 PPR points per game at wide receiver is better than A.J. Brown's season-long average. Now, I know what you're thinking, but JJ, he had that performance earlier this year against Washington where he scored 49 PPR points. Take that away, he's not nearly as good. And that's not wrong. I'm just not one to just take a performance away, though, especially when you're not doing that for other wide receivers. But even with that removed, Moore's averaging 16.6 PPR points per game with Justin Fields. That's still a low-end wide receiver 1 season. Moore has been really strong this year, and all the peripherals are there. Like I said, his target share per game with Justin Fields, it's an awesome 30%. And according to Fantasy Life's utilization report, which you can check out yourself over on fantasylife.com, DJ Moore is 3rd in the NFL this year in air yard share. It's been a roller coaster, but Moore really has lived up to expectation this year. The New York Jets offense isn't just bad, it's historically bad. The Jets have scored 10 offensive touchdowns this year in 11 games. That's 0.9 touchdowns per game. No team has scored fewer than 1 touchdown per game since the 2006 Oakland Raiders. You can use Breece Hall, you can use Garrett Wilson, but you and I know that their ceilings are capped each week, and it sucks. Rashee Rice had a big game in Week 12. He led the Chiefs wide receivers in routes run, and his 31.3% target share was by far a season high. His previous high was 19%. He ended up scoring 24.7 PPR points, another high on the season. Here's the problem, though, and it's been a problem all season long. Kansas City obnoxiously rotates their wide receivers, and they also did that in Week 12. He may have led the Chiefs wide receivers in routes run, but he ran a route on 66% of Patrick Mahomes' dropbacks. Now, that was a season high for Rice. That's good. But it wasn't a season high by that much. And it wasn't a very big number either. The hope with Rice is that this performance forces him on the field more. As I've been saying for weeks now, he's easily been Kansas City's best wide receiver this year. When looking at any advanced metric, it hasn't even been close. So hopefully we get more Rashee Rice moving forward. Now, speaking of the Chiefs, Jerick McKinnon didn't play in Week 12, and Isaiah Pacheco had a bigger receiving role as a result. His route participation was almost 75%. His previous season high was 53%. So there was a big spike in the number of routes that Isaiah Pacheco was running. But he also hit a season high 15.6% target share. And he saw his typical workload on the ground, handling 83% of the team's running back rushes. Pacheco is a very, very legit RB1, at least from a ceiling perspective, without Jerick McKinnon in that lineup. The last trend this week is about Evan Engram. He still hasn't found the end zone this year despite having 524 receiving yards. Across the league, tight ends are scoring a touchdown on every 157 receiving yards. So Ingram's obviously playing below expectation. Now keep in mind, where players see targets is really important in understanding how many touchdowns they should have. Yards to touchdowns is just a very quick way of looking at it. According to Pro Football Focus's expected touchdowns formula, Engram should have 1.7 touchdowns this year, not 0. But based on his yardage total, that 1.7 number is lower than most would probably expect. And that's based on where he's seeing his looks. So yes, he's definitely a candidate for touchdown regression. There's no doubt. But it's not by some insane amount. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Make sure you're subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/@LateRoundFF. And there's an Instagram as well, @LateRoundFF. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll talk to you tomorrow with the Sleeper Show.